Good evening. I'd like to thank you for coming this evening and welcoming you to the Archives and History lecture series. My name is Joe Geiger. I'm the Director of Archives and History. I want to note just a couple of upcoming events that we have before we introduce tonight's speaker. On May the 17th, Jack Canfield will be here. I think he was the press secretary for Governor Hewlett Smith, and he's going to talk about events during the year 1968, so that should be a very interesting event. Again, May 17th. On May 31st, we'll have our first of our block lecture series with Anna Evans Gilmer. She'll be speaking on May 31st. That's also a Thursday. Tonight we have a very special speaker. Nat DeBruin earned his bachelor's degree in history in 1976 at Texas A&M and was commissioned in the U.S. Army. His military career spanned 19 years in a variety of assignments both in the United States and overseas, including the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in 1989 and Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm. After retiring from the Army as a major in 1995, DeBruin earned his master's in library science from the University. Am I pushing you forward, Nat? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're fast forward.
Sorry about that. We're fast forward. Nat got his master's in library science from the University of Maryland, College Park in 1996, and he joined the faculty at Marshall University in 2006, and that's where I became familiar with Nat. He became head of archives and special collections in 2013, but for many years he has been certainly a person who we turn to when we have questions regarding archives. He's going to talk about a special topic this evening, obviously. His presentation is entitled Time Capsules to Our Past, Identifying and Preserving Our Photographic Images. I'm honored to have with us this evening Nat DeBruin.
Thank you, Joe. And that goes both ways. We are in constant, we at Marshall talk to the folks at the archives, to Randy and Dick Faust and Deborah. We get information from them too. We're great at sharing, and I think that's one good thing about our relationship. And I know Dick is back there. He is the expert on photographs. What I'm going to show you tonight is really a modification of a brainchild that one of my graduate students put together for a workshop at the West Virginia Library Association in 2015. And she has gone on, she was a history graduate student, gone on and gotten her library science degree with an archival management background. And she is now the archivist for the American Fire Protection Association up in Amherst, Massachusetts. So this is for Caitlin, who put this together. All right, I'm going to try and go a little slower than Joe did. Okay. What I want to do is give you a very brief history of photography, and we're not going to, until the very end of the presentation, dip into digital photography. That's a whole another animal, some of the special considerations for that we're not going to go into tonight, other than to give you some pointers, some tips on what to do with the digital photographs you already have. Part of knowing how to care for and preserve photographic images is knowing how they're made, those processes that were used since the beginning of photography. Those processes depend on how you take care of certain images and photographs. And some of those preservation challenges, some of them are things that we can't overcome. But there are some things that we can do to help preserve our photographs and make them last a little longer. And then at the very end, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. It's nice to have the expert in the back of the room, because if I can't answer it, Dick probably can. And then I've got some examples of some of the photography that we have at Marshall in our special collections, and I've got some white gloves up here, and you're welcome to come up and actually touch some of these images which predate the Civil War. So we're talking 160-year-old photography images here, and it's amazing how sharp and how clear they really are, even at this age. Okay. So photographs have been around for a long time. We have used them to capture everything from athletics, our children, nature, war, famous personalities. It's really, it really is a time capsule. We can go back as far as there are photographs and get hopefully a reasonable likeness of what things actually were like at that time. Wrong button, okay? But, okay, it didn't take Adobe Photoshop to come along to modify photographs. That the photographs on the left taken of General Sherman and his staff, one of the members wasn't there for the first photograph, so they kind of blended him in later. And then, of course, we all know that the National Enquirer and Weekly World News have taken photographic license with a lot of things. Okay. We're really looking back. Most people think that the daguerreotype is the first photographic image or process that was used. It's really the first one that became commercially viable. But as early as the 1820s, people were experimenting with different types of photography. This is called a heliograph. And this is enhanced. The actual photograph is barely visible now, but it was just some paper sensitized to be sensitive to light, and the photographer placed it on a windowsill and let it be exposed for a certain period of time, and this is the image he got. So all the way back, this is the first known. There may have been others that tried it before then, but 1826 is really the first known photographic image that we have. Okay, so some of the basics of photography, or analog photography, if you will, is to start with a base material. Then there's an emulsion that's put on top of that. It consists of different, the basis materials can be different things. The emulsion is different materials, but here's the key. There's some light-sensitive salts or minerals that are put in to that emulsion that are sensitized, that are sensitive to light. Okay? So the base material can be any variety of things. We've got actual metal, tin types and ferrotypes, and I have examples of those up here. What happened? Ferro is Latin for iron. What does iron do over time? It rusts. And the ferrotype that I have up here, if you look at it closely, you will see around the edges where the emulsion has worn off is actually starting to rust. Okay, not as bad as our cars do after a hard winter, but paper is probably one of the more common, at least in older types of photography, where there is no actual emulsion. That's just a piece of paper that's been sensitized with those materials, those minerals, and exposed then to light. Okay. Glass, and I have a couple of glass plate negatives up here that you can look at. And then what we're more familiar with now, film. Excuse me, and the film that's in use today, you can still buy it. It's still available. Is plastic safety film. And that's kind of the end of a long series of experiments with film, including some nitrate-based materials that were found to be very dangerous and highly combustible, and those were in use for a while back in the 1930s and 40s, and then we moved to plastic safety film. On top of that base, whatever it is, metal, paper, plastic, glass, is going to go that emulsion, that usually a liquid that holds the light-sensitive salts. So in the early days of photography, several people experimented with lots of different things, including albumin, which are really egg whites, nitrocellulose, collodion, which is mostly used today, or a gelatin base. All it has to do is suspend that light-sensitive material that's in it long enough to be exposed to light. Okay? An example of that, here is a glass plate negative, and you can come up and take a look at this later. This is a glass plate negative where you can see the emulsion is actually starting to peel off. It's dried out. This is probably circa 1890s photograph. It's a glass plate where that liquid emulsion with the silver nitrate salts was put on it. As it dried out, and over time, the emulsion is actually starting to peel off. And you can come up and you can take a look at it, and if you hold it up to the light, you can actually see there are some images still available there. Okay. So we've got that emulsion that we're going to put in a pinch of salt. Okay, and several silver nitrate is probably the most common, but there are others. The potassium ferrocyanide, I can't say it too well, but that's what gives us that cyanotype, that blue tint, which is, when you come up to look at these later, this is so sharp and clear that ferrocyanide gives an excellent amount of detail in those photographs. They're not real popular. They were for a few years back in the early or late 19th century, but it isn't really an accurate representation of, it doesn't look like you want it to look like. It's blue. So they weren't very popular for very long, but they're out there. So now we've got the base, we've got our emulsion, and with that light-sensitive material in it, let's take a picture. And that is exposing that sensitized solution to light. Okay? The intensity of the light as it hits that sensitized solution is what is going to give us a photograph in the end. How long we expose it to the light, the intensity of the light, all determine how that emulsion is going to react, how those salts are going to react. So that in the negative image, which is what we get with analog photography, that negative image, the darker portions of the negative are the ones that were exposed to the most light. Okay? So in the process of printing those out then, and bringing the positive image out, we can see how that is opposite, how the woman, let's see if I can laser here. All right, okay. So the woman here on the left appears very light in the negative, but her dress is actually very dark. Okay. So this is the hard part of photography. Okay, this is the part of bringing that negative image out of or into a positive image. So we're going to place that negative on sensitized paper and expose it to light. That sensitized paper then is going to go in a chemical bath to develop it until that image, that positive image, comes out. We're going to take it out of the developing bath and put it in a bath to fix it, and basically that fixing stops the chemical process. And that's the person that's developing really has to have a knack for that. You can set timers and you can do other things, but the person that develops it really has to have a level of expertise. Once the chemical process is stopped in the fixing bath, then we're going to take it out and put it in a wash, usually distilled water that's going to take all the chemicals off of the paper now and allow us to hang that photo, hang that image now up to dry in the dark room. So we're keeping it red. We don't want any more light to be, any more exposure to light for that image. Okay? And then we have our positive image. So that's very basic. I'm not an expert. I've never personally done this myself, but it is quite a process. And how well it's done determines how long your photographs are going to last. I'll show you some examples when you come up here. It's called silvering, and it's where not all in the fixing portion of the process that it wasn't fixed properly, so that silver nitrate is still active in that positive image that we had here. If it's still sensitive to light, it's going to change over time. The more light it's exposed to, that silver nitrate continues to develop out. And I'll show you. You can look at some of the images that I have up here, and if you tilt it just right, you can see that it's silver. That silver nitrate is starting to come out of the photograph. Another method of developing is just printing out paper. We're going to put that same negative image on chemically sensitized paper, expose it to light again, but we don't have to develop it. The chemicals for developing are already in the paper, and so we still have to fix it. We still have to stop the chemical process from continuing and then wash out all those chemicals so that the image is finally processed. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. I mean, again, there's different base materials that hold emulsion differently. There are different emulsions that hold the salts differently. The different salts give different types of photographs. So there's a lot of variety, but there really is only one process. And to preserve those images, we've got to do some things to keep them from losing them. There really is an axis of evil, okay? Photographs are highly susceptible to high temperatures, high humidity, and light. I've already talked about how light continues to, if those images are not developed properly, continues to work on those. Look at them a little bit. We'll talk about those in a minute and how you can help take care of those. Mold. It's really, this is Memphis, Tennessee Garrison, who was one of the West Virginia people very instrumental in the NAACP, in the formation of that back in the 1920s. We have her collection. Unfortunately, it sat in a garage for about 20 years after her death before we were able to acquire it. And then Lyle and the folks there at Marshall took a look inside the box and saw things like this and said, we're going to close it back up, and it stayed for about another 20 years just in our collections until Caitlin Walker, the same student who put together the presentation, came out and said, we need to do something with this. And so we got some photographs that we were able to digitize and clean up a little bit in Photoshop, but this was the sad state for most of them. So mold, another enemy is insects. This was this is obviously not a photograph, but insect damage. Paper is, it's organic material. Bugs like organic material, and so they will eat photographs. Here's part of that poor developing process. This photograph wasn't properly fixed or washed, and those salts continue to interact with light, and this photograph is really starting to fade out quite a bit. Improper storage and handling. This is what happens when you put things in a box and other things lean up against them, or they get dropped on the floor. Another example is, especially with large panoramic photos, they get rolled up. And unfortunately, they stayed rolled so long. If you come up and look at this when you come up, it's starting to crease. Even though it's rolled, the paper is drying out and it's starting to crease. So we're in danger of losing this over time. Okay. Conservation. Conservation and preservation are two different things, okay? Conservation is trying to go back and restore something to its original condition, or as close as possible as we can with today's technology and materials. We're going to try to return it to the original. Preservation, which is what we do primarily, and I probably here at the archives, preservation is trying to prevent any further damage from happening. We're going to try and do minimal things to keep the item from deteriorating any further through proper storage and handling, but we're not going to try and bring it back to its original condition. It's usually very expensive, very time consuming, very tedious. There are some materials that may be valuable enough to your collection or to what you want to do, that going back and conserving those is very important. If it's a George Washington letter and it's torn, we probably want to go back and try and repair George Washington's correspondence. Okay? Preservation, on the other hand, is stopping further deterioration. And restoration is not conservation. There are companies out there that will take your photographs and your money and will tell you that they're going to bring it back to life. Well, this was a black and white photo. It was never in color. How do we know that that young man's shirt was actually brown and white? It may have been red and white or green and white. So just because it's restored and it's colorized doesn't necessarily mean that it's back to its original condition or shape. Okay? Some of the challenges that you probably will face with your personal materials are one of our favorites, the magnetic photo album. I'm sure you've all seen those. The magnetic part is glue. Okay, there's no magnetism involved. Okay, and then it's got that plastic flap over it, which is probably not, we'll talk about that, is probably not archivally safe plastic. Okay, but now we've got a photograph that is permanently, well, this one, actually, can you hear it? Starting to come off a little bit. And that's simply because the glue, it's old enough that that glue has dried out, and we can probably remove this over time. Okay, so really, if you have these, I'm sorry. Okay. Color photography, a whole different process, again, with that emulsion and the chemicals that are used in color photography, make them especially susceptible to light, especially the early days of color photography. Very easy to have those things fade out. And then you've got, I understand these are making a comeback, the old Polaroid images, and you can see how the blue dye in this one has really come out and discolored this image. Okay, so those are challenges. Scrapbooks, the bane of archives. Okay, and we would have thought that they would have died back in the 1920s. This is one of our Marshall co-ed. We call them Facebook circa 1920. They really were. These especially the young ladies at Marshall. There's photographs, there's invitations, there's dance cards, there's pressed flowers. We've got one that's just fantastic. The young lady that put it together wrote the names of her beaux on cigarettes, Camels, and glued those into the scrapbook. You keep going through the scrapbook, and then you come across a cigarette that's broken with that guy's name on it. So it's like, what did Bill do to deserve a broken cigarette in Helen's scrapbook? So those are always a challenge. The photographs in them, this one is actually pretty good because she didn't glue them in with that mucilage. She didn't glue them to the page. She used picture corners so that she could write on the back, and we actually can identify some of those pictures. Scrapbooking is not dead. It's alive and well today. There's an industry built around that, and it's okay to do that. It's a good way to conserve or preserve your memories. Just don't glue the stuff into the scrapbook. Use picture corners. They're available. Don't make it permanent unless if you're going to leave it to posterity, don't glue it to the page. Okay. Oops, wrong button. Okay. The rolled photographs, I've already showed you that. And usually they're rolled because they are that large format. So flattening those, framing those can be very expensive, you've got to have some place to display them once you get them rolled. But once they're rolled, they're very, very difficult to unroll. So what can you do with the big three? Ideally, 68 degrees when you're storing them with other materials, which is what we have to do. We don't have a separate cold storage area just for our photographic images, so they're stored with our regular manuscript collections. And what we generally say is, if it's, and this is cold for humans, okay? 68 degrees may feel comfortable for a couple hours in the summer, but generally that's pretty cool. If it's too cold for you to go in the room, it's probably good for your photos, okay? But when the temperature drops, moisture condenses. That's why frost forms on the windshield of your car. Okay, so with low temperatures, we've got to have low humidity. So we're keeping it cool, we're keeping it dry, and we're going to keep it in the dark, basically. So our materials, we do have some things on display. We generally rotate our displays because ambient light, especially ultraviolet light, will continue to interact with these photographs. Even the best developer is not going to get everything out. So over time, those will continue to be affected by light. So archival practice, general archival practice, if we're going to display something, and that's the beauty of digital photography now and scanners and all these things. If I want to display a cyanotype, like this blueprint here, I can scan that, I can mount it on an acid-free material, and I can put that in a display cabinet, and you won't be able to tell the difference. If you look real closely, if we didn't crop it just right or didn't do something, you might be able to tell that it's a facsimile. But we don't generally display the actual artifacts, especially photographs, because of that, the problems with light. Okay, so there are enclosures that you can use. I didn't bring the wide sample. There's catalogs that we use that provide different types of storage materials, plastic materials. This is where the PVC, the polyvinyl chloride, outgasses and can actually damage your photographs. So polypropylene plastic is what most of these, when they sell them as archival quality, that means they're polypropylene. So they're a stable material. They won't off-gas and provide chemical damage to your materials. But we're still going to keep them in the dark. I mean, these albums that we've got, all these negative strips and these 35 millimeter slides, again, are still housed in our temperature controlled, environmentally safe location. They're great. They allow us to pick things up and move them around and touch them without having to wear white gloves all the time, but they can be damaging if they're not the right kind of plastic. Okay. Storage boxes. Everybody's got them. Whoa. Did I get timed out? I'm talking too long. I'm not sure. I can keep talking while you're working. We use acid-free boxes. You can get photo storage boxes from several manufacturers, different sizes for different types of photographs. What we do is we try to keep photographs standing up on edge. Okay, when we get back to my slides, standing them on edge is important because if you lay them flat and you start stacking a whole lot of them together, you get the chance for that emulsion. If there's any kind of humidity, any kind of moisture in the air, the photographs will stick together. Okay, so glossy photographs are usually printed on a clay paper. That clay tends to hold the image better. That's why your magazines and other things they're glossy. The next time, before you throw out that old lady's home journal, get it wet. And then let it dry out for a while. And what you'll have is a brick. Okay, it's clay, and so it will turn into a brick. Unfortunately, with a lot of photographs, the same thing happens. So I have here a brick of Marshall baseball players from the 1980s that has gotten wet. We actually have a very high-tech, you want me to fast forward through now? Okay. We're going to keep them stored on edge. We're going to keep them snug but not tight. And we're going to try and keep them in that controlled environment. Okay. Don't let them sag. When they start to sag is when you get the photographs that start to bend, and they'll start to roll eventually. Okay, I'll tell you how to get them apart here in a second. Okay. Storing them flat, you can do that. You just have to be sure that you don't put a lot of weight on it. And if you are able to put some interleaving paper between the things that you do store flat, and that's usually large format things, that interleaving paper will help keep the actual emulsion from sticking to the paper or the backing of the photograph above it. Okay. So I've showed you some sticking together, especially when it gets wet. Keep them cool, dark, and dry. A closet in the interior portion of your house is as close as you're going to get to a perfect environment for your photos. Okay, the temperature is fairly constant unless you like to keep it cold in the winter or warm in the summer. That should stay very relatively constant. And it's in the dark. Okay. Store them in your attic, boxes in the basement, the garage. No. Okay. Every one of those has problems with insects, possibility of mold, high moisture, high humidity. They're just not good places to store your images. Okay, here we go. Here is my high-tech rehumidifier. It's one of those storage boxes that you buy at Walmart to stick under your bed to put sweaters in. Okay, and then those are the plastic like dish racks that you can get to put in your kitchen cabinets to keep plates and things separated. You put one of those in the bottom of the bin, put about a ½ inch of water in it. Put your images on top of the rack so they're not touching the water. Close the lid, put it in the sunlight, let it get a little warm, a little humid, a little damp, and then you can start to peel those apart. Very carefully. You go back and check periodically. We usually try and do it every couple of hours, depending on the temperature that we're able to get the room to, and you can actually start separating the images from each other. Okay, so we've got a couple here. Doesn't mean they're not going to have some damage. Doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect, but now we could go back in and scan this picture of Mr. Scott Shoemate, 1986 Marshall baseball, and clean it up a little bit with Photoshop, enough that we could put it in our on a display or provide an image to somebody that was looking for that. So it is possible. to resolve some of those issues, but it's not a perfect solution. Okay. So, reformatting is another way to preserve your photos, and that's one way to do that is to take a picture of it with another camera, okay, or with a digital camera. Digital photography is better simply because when we scan, our scanners use very high intensity light, and so we say our rule is kind of one pass only, because if that image is not set, if they're still sensitive to light, that scan can cause even more damage. So we're going to do it once, capture that image, and go from there. The quality of the images can be enhanced and improved. Like I said, we can fix Mr. Shoemate's photo there. We can clean it up a little bit and make that image usable, but it's not the original. It's still a copy. It's still a surrogate for the original that we're going to keep. Okay. But the beauty of it is, at least for us at Marshall and here at the archives, is those images can be shared online, and that's how Joe and we can put up all these great photographs of the people in this state that have made an impact. Even Mr. Shoemate from 1986 may be famous someday. We don't know. Okay. So here's another. How many of you have 35 millimeter slides? Thousands of them. That's what we did. They're great photographs, but finding a slide projector these days is almost finding a bulb to replace the one that burned out in your slide projector is even harder. Okay, so there is some digital technology out there right now that will take those photographs and turn them into digital images then that you can use to display however you want. Okay. Probably the biggest thing with digital photography is what we run into at home is we take lots of pictures and say, well, I can go back and I can delete that one later. Okay, when you were going to have to print out and send your roll of film to the developer, you were kind of a little more careful on what you took pictures of or how many pictures you took, because you were going to pay for them to print each one of those out. And if it was color, it was going to be more expensive. You wanted multiple copies, or you wanted an 8x10 and not a 5x7, you were going to pay for that. So with digital, we tend to take more pictures because we can, and we can always go back and delete them. So where are they? Are they still on your camera? Have you downloaded them to your computer? Maybe you've got them on a hard drive somewhere. Which ones are most important? You know, go back and do that. Clean that up. Clean up those thousands of photographs you have that you don't really want anymore, or that they were poor quality. Get rid of them. Organize them, and then here's the real key: make copies and store them in different places. Physical copy is better if you can put them on a CD or a thumb drive or a separate external hard drive from your computer. And now with cloud storage, depending, you know, there's a certain amount of cloud storage that's free if you subscribe to some of these services. Google or some others will give you some cloud space free. If you take a lot of photographs, you may have to pay a little extra to store more photographs, but keep them in separate places because that's the way you're going to protect those digital images. Okay. What are your questions? I'll answer as much as I can. Like I say, if I can't answer your question, Dick is here. He can help. And then we'll go from there, and there's an opportunity to come up and look and touch and see all these pictures. I've got one. I'm sorry. He beat you.
If you have some very, very large panorama prints, and that they've been rolled up for quite some time. What's the best way to go about getting those flattened?
We have done some of that with that rehumidification chamber. We've got a couple of different sizes. One size, a small one to do these kind of things. We've got a larger one for the rolled photographs. Use that as the paper gets more moisture in it. It will start to unroll to a certain point, and then we go out and we use. It's kind of like blotter paper, but it's acid-free, and we press it. We then use weights that we constantly change the blotter paper out because it's absorbing that moisture back out of the image, and use weights until it gets to the point where, as far as we can get it, it's still going to have a tendency to roll up. So we have flat storage cabinets. I'm sure I know they have them here. I've seen them. Flat storage cabinets where we can put some more paper on them and keep them stored flat. It can be done, but it's a slow and it's very tedious. And do you really want it? I mean, if this is a panoramic photograph of your grandmother's graduating class from, Huntington High School, and you want to keep that, then it's worth doing that. Okay, I don't know how many copies I have of the 1937 graduating class at Marshall University. We've got 2 of them framed that are hanging up, and then I probably have about 8 more. This everybody kept that. Must have been a really great class, the class of 37. So, okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was going to ask the card photos. Like the second one from the far right. Yeah.
This one? Okay.
Where they become discolored, or I don't know whether is that mold that's on them, or like along the edges. Is there anything that you can do for that?
There are not.
I know that's probably more the preservation or
That's
the
more the
conservation.
conservation. The preservation part, you could probably take what we use for our glass plate negatives and for some other ones is just a cotton ball. If it doesn't come off with just light rubbing, then we get it a little damp with a little rubbing alcohol and very lightly rub it off. And if it doesn't come off with that, it's not coming off. Yeah, a lot of that comes from, especially this is called a cabinet card, which was a popular format back in the 19th century, along with these carte de vie that I have up here, and they were put in albums. Very popular to have an album such as this. That was another the carte de vie size, but the paper is not the best. Okay, it's got a leather binding that's starting to deteriorate, and all that can have an effect on what's inside. So this is neat because it's a complete album of U.S. and Confederate figures, general officers and politicians, prominent figures during the Civil War. So this came from our Civil War collection, and so we're going to keep it intact like this.
So if you have an album like that has, like in my case, like 75% of them, I have no idea who these people are. But in the later, towards the end of the album, I actually know who some of the people are. Would it be better to take those pictures out of the album and store them someplace else, or do something else with them than leave them in the album? Or?
You'd have to take a look at it individually. Depending on how they're in the album, it might cause more damage to try and take them out than to just leave them in there. Again, with those magnetic photographs, the glue is starting to finally dry out, and I could probably remove those fairly safely. But some of the glue, when you start to separate it, will pull the base material off the emulsion. And so sometimes it's better just to leave it as it is, keep it in the environmental controlled, low exposure light, and make copies. Digitize, scan it. Yeah.
You
Yes,
said
sir.
you had some pictures from the Civil War. Can
Yes.
you give a little bit of history as to who may have taken the picture and how they did it with the amount of exposure stuff that they had to go through?
None of the ones that we have are Matthew Brady prints. Those are all at the National Archives. But the process that Matthew Brady used was, where did I put it now? Is a wet glass plate. Yeah, okay. So here's a small glass plate that we have in our collection. In the field, in his little wagons that went around that Matthew Brady had, he would have the glass, and they would have all the chemicals. And at that time, in the early part of the Civil War, that process had to happen very quickly. They had to mix the emulsion, mix the salts, get it on the glass plate, get it into the camera, and then expose it for the right amount of time, take it out, and develop it fairly quickly before that emulsion started to dry out as part of the chemical process. Most of, how many of you, it's kind of iconic pictures of the dead soldiers and the dead horses at Antietam, staged. The Confederate sharpshooter at the Devil's Den, staged after the battle. Because the process took so long to get the camera. There are no action shots from the Civil War. There's no, the photos would have been extremely blurry. The guys are not going to stand there taking those photographs while shells are going off around them and everything else. So most of the Civil War photographs that Brady took of the battlefield were staged afterwards, because you could get you could get things to stand still long enough. Photography in the Civil War. There are some pictures. I showed you a picture of Abraham Lincoln a little earlier. There are some other studio shots of Lincoln and other people from that time frame where you can see the brace that they had on their neck. They're sitting in a chair and their heads were held still by basically a brace or something. Because any kind of movement, because the exposure times were very long, if there was any movement, you get a blurry image. As the chemical processes improved, you've all seen the guys holding the bar where they put the powder in the top, and the big flash bars. They put like black powder almost, and smile, and poof, this burst of light comes out, this cloud of smoke, and that was early flash photography. So as the technology improved, as the chemical processes improved, you could start taking, as cameras improved, so you had a shutter speed that was adjustable, or a focal length that you could change to get a close-up image versus a distant image. Photography improved. But those Civil War photographs are really kind of...
Yeah, it was rapid improvement.
Yes.
He was experimenting, obviously, and he had the cohorts and colleagues and people competing against him.
Sure.
And it was really quick as how quickly it got.
Oh, absolutely. And these, I showed you this one image of the glass plate that had the emulsion coming off, but it's also, you can see that the glass is broken, and I think we have about 14,000 images in our collection, and about 10,000 of them we've been able to save, that they're in a condition, they're in this condition, which is with a little cleaning up, we can digitize that and make our scanner will take a negative image and scan it to a positive image, so we don't have to go through multiple gyrations to get the positive digital image for this. But the photography studio that we got these from packed them poorly. They packed them flat. A box this size of glass plate negatives weighs about 75 pounds. They're very hard to lift. They're very heavy, and so they were stored improperly. A lot of them broke because they were not stored with anything in between them. The emulsion started to dry out. Come on. Anyway, we've been able to save about 10,000 of them. We store them in much smaller boxes, so they're easier to lift, and they're all stored on edge, and we all keep acid-free paper between every image. Now, we haven't digitized them all. We probably never will. If you look at this one, it's a family, mother and father with the small child in the middle, totally unidentified. Have no idea who that was, when it was taken, where it was taken, and we have literally thousands of images very similar to that. So we picked some representative images from our collections to display, but you know, I can only have, you know, so many images of Victorian woman with large hat, or young gentleman with parted hair and high collar. You know, we've got literally hundreds of each of those. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have a question. I have several boxes of old black and white negatives that are, they're not 35 millimeter, they're like 2-inch, a little bigger. What can I do with those? Like, how would I go about trying to get, if it's an image that I want an actual photo of, how would I go about getting something like that?
There are companies that will scan those for you, just like I said, where I can turn a positive or a negative image on a negative into a positive image with just one pass, one scan, and they can create digital images for you.
Oh, okay.
If you're willing to
It's
do-
not something that you can just do yourself with the scanner. You have to have a special scanner.
You could do it, but you would have to go through several steps. You'd have to have the software that would enable you to take that negative image and then convert it to a positive image. And Photoshop will do that. The higher end of Photoshop you get, the better it's going to be. So if you have, kind of goes back to which are the ones that are most important, which are the ones that you really want to save, and if you're willing to go through the expense, you can do that.
Okay. And just Google it.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I have a picture of two of my aunt and uncle, and it's on oval glass, but it looks like it's on the glass inside. How do I protect that?
Keep it in the dark. Keep the temperature low. Keep the humidity low. Some of these images up here, I think, I'm not sure, it may be the Ambro type here of Bishop Whelan, is actually a negative that's on the glass, and then they put paper behind it, the dark paper, so that it appears as a positive image. It probably is right on the glass, and that was fairly common how they did color pictures. They would print directly on a glass, and then they could go behind it and add the color for the, especially with people on that. So.
And the glass is oval.
Keep it in the dark. Yes, yeah, that's very unusual. That's
My grandfather was a photographer.
okay, yeah. I would try and get a digital image of that.
I do.
Okay.
And it's in the hallway with no light, no external light at all.
Okay. That's probably the best thing you can do with it. Okay. Yes?
I know sometimes, particularly with scrapbooks, you'll encounter images that have adhesives on them from gluing or taping. What are the best methods of trying to deal with that?
We generally just leave them alone. I mean, if it hasn't damaged the photograph, and that's another thing you can watch for, that base on a photo is, if you start writing on that with a pen or something that is going to make an impression on the base, a pencil or a ballpoint pen, what you're doing is you're pushing through to the emulsion on the other side, and you can actually damage that emulsion, put a dent in it, and that makes it more susceptible to further damage. I would say if you can't take it off with a regular rubber eraser or that little bit of distilled water or rubbing alcohol, very little amount, if you can't rub it off with that, then it's probably better to just leave it. And we're talking scale, because we have literally thousands of photographs. Your personal collection, you may have a lot too, but some of them we have to pick and choose.
I have another question.
Okay.
I know a lot of people shoot digital. I shoot digital, and I like to look at photos, so I print them off. How do I know that where I'm getting them printed, that the chemicals or the paper, because they do it instant now, that the images will actually last, that they're, fixed, that they won't, I mean, as opposed to like the old time, like when you used to take it down to Merrill's, they had the chemicals and they would develop them and fix them and everything like that. And now they just have the paper that just feeds through the machine.
Yeah, well, and it's an inkjet printer or a laser type printer that's
Now,
printing that.
how will those images hold up?
And help me out here, John or Dick, I don't know that we know. They haven't been around long enough for us to really know how long those are going to last.
My impression is they're probably not going to be that great in another 100 or 150 years.
Right.
But yes, you're
Well,
right.
I won't be around then, but yeah.
And that's why what we don't throw the originals away. If we scan these and create a digital image for a display or something else, we keep all the originals. We do not get rid of those, because that digital copy is susceptible to also your computer crashes or your house burns down or something else and destroys your computer. Those are gone. So we keep the originals, and that's probably the best thing to do. Who knows? The digital photography has, I mean, look how fast that's moving. We talked about how fast the analog version went in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It's the same way with the digital. It's all going so fast. Pretty soon we'll be printing them on the glass, on curved glass.
Is the archives open to the public?
Marshall, absolutely, 8 to 4:30, Monday through Friday.
What building?
We're in the Morrow Library, the old library there on 3rd Avenue. As you come down Route 60 or 3rd Avenue coming into Huntington, we're the old library right across the street from that new engineering complex. So we're open. We're not open on the 4th of July, Memorial Day, or Thanksgiving, or Christmas, but we're open through the summer. Actually, the best time to come is in the summer, because you're not fighting, 15,000 students for parking. But we're open to the public, absolutely. Okay. You are now welcome to come up. I've got some white gloves here, especially with some of these, the daguerreotypes and the tin types. I would just ask you to put on a glove and come up and touch.
What's the difference between the daguerreotype and the tin type, or the ferrotype?
The ferrotype is on an iron backing, the tin type is on a tin backing, and the daguerreotype is on glass. So it's the base material is the only difference. So please come up, touch.
Thank you, Dad.
Okay, you're welcome.